afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Graveyard Shift. So the pressure is now on our two esteemed speakers to make this really entertaining and worth your while for having stuck around. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Leonard Wantchekon from Princeton University to start us off on this really important, what I hope is really insightful conversation around governance.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, yeah, all right. So, throughout the sessions, we heard quite a bit about state capacity and experimentation. So, I'll be talking about how crucial, how important state capacity is for development. In fact, is the main driver of development, and why we should go beyond a very technocratic description of what state capacity is and incorporate politics and institutions into the way we should fix or we should improve state capacity. And then I will also, in the end, talk about ways you can do it through experimentation. We focus on deliberation. Public reason is going to be clear later on. But before, I need to tell you how personal this is. This is me on the left as a communist pro-democracy activist in 1983. Angry, serious. Things have changed over the years. But at least it shows how I was determined to not only study political distortion, talk about state capacity, but do something about it. So, interestingly, months after getting into a PhD program at Northwestern, I didn't wait to write my dissertation proposal, first year. And guess what? It's political mechanism development. I have some comment there by Michele Boldrin, and says, why don't you go and talk to Per Krusell? Because those days, political economy and development was not, very, very popular. Obviously, I have to step back and then run to Chris Udry in the room to focus on more standard development research. Anyway, okay, so as I said earlier, state capacity is really the social infrastructure of development, and this is, now well studied by macro development literature that focus on total factor productivity and misallocation of factors as the main driver of differences between poor and rich countries. So the story, the fact is that at least 50% of the per capita income differences between countries is by TFP. Then TFP is responsible for more than 50%. When you think about it, it's really massive. It's interesting because we think that capital and labor drive development, but in fact, is this not properly measured unknown factor that is the key. So, and as I said earlier, there is at the core of the social infrastructure of a country is state capacity. So what is state capacity? It's the ability of the state to get things done. And then, the focus on is state autonomous, does it have enough authority? Is the country publicly managed properly? Do we have resources? And there are several ways to measure state capacity, focus on coercive power, public good provision, taxation, macroeconomic management, and structural interventions. So, but my critique of this approach is that it's too technocratic, too apolitical. It focuses too much on resource generation. So it's important to learn how things are getting done. But it's equally important, it's important to know, to measure, if things are being done properly, but it's crucially important to know how they are being done. For instance, Russia might have higher state capacity than Mauritius, but what will drive the comparison between Russia and Mauritius or Sweden, for instance, will be how it's being done. The social cost, the oppression that it takes to get things done in one place. So it tends to ignore, social and agency cost, and also what I think is that it doesn't necessarily properly integrate the role of institutions. So, for instance, we might normatively prefer, or even positively, prefer a place where things are done in a more inclusive manner with better engagement from citizens than a place where everything is cohesive and top-down. So the nature of political institutions are very key, democratic versus autocratic, for instance. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to try to, clarify a concept in political economy that I will term political distortion, that I described at length in my Kuznets lecture 2 years ago. And I will use this knowledge to think about ways to correct political distortion, strengthen state capacity. But what I'm going to term as institutional editing and experimentation. For the sake of to be concrete, I'm going to focus on institutions that promotes political agency, like public reason, deliberation, and social contract. So I'm going to have a number of experiments that try to promote state capacity building through deliberation and social contract. And I will show how deliberation, which is a key component of African political culture, can help strengthen state capacity by better information sharing, prevent coordination failure in public good provision, for instance, and by promoting individual and group agency on the part of the citizens. So what is political distortion? So, in micro one-on-one or 101, we talk about ideal government, benevolent dictator, social planner. So in politics, I will define as political distortion the gap that a social planner, a benevolent dictator will do politically, institutionally, versus what we observe. In other words, we're going to assume that politics come in the way of development from a normative perspective. So we always start with what a benchmark, a normative benchmark, and then measure what we observe, and then define the gap between the two as political distortion. So, we're using this framework, state captured by politicians who implement policy, preferential taxes, regulation, for instance, are de facto weaker, even if they generate more resources. So we also want to focus on institutions. Distortion is one thing, but the institution that generates the distortion is something that will be the focus of this talk. So I'll give some examples. There is a classic paper by Khwaja and Mian showing that politically connected firms in Pakistan borrow 45% more from the public banks and have 50% default rates, which lead to anywhere from 0.3 to 0.9% GDP loss per year. So the benchmark here is to get rid of the freaking politician from boards. That's the benchmark. So the source of a distortion is the presence of politicians on the boards of banks. So that's the distortion. I think that's the cause of the distortion. That's the institutional failure that led to that distortion. So there is a large literature on clientelism and patronage. For instance, a colleague of mine, Begg, shows how landowners get elected because if you don't elect them, you lose your tenancy contract. Well, the solution is to have a model or to have voting model which is based on political preferences, where there is no economic dependency between voters and candidates. Robin has a great paper on favoritism and road building in Kenya, where they show that under democracy, you have less ethnic favoritism. On the dictatorship, you have more. And the interesting about that paper is the fact that they look at the benchmark is the road network that will maximize market access. They compare that with the existing road network, and the gap between the two is what it's the political distortion. So, okay. As I said earlier, much of the literature in state capacity tend to focus on technical expertise of bureaucrats or state agents, And the solution is how you attract talent by paying people more, by having various effective strategies for revenue mobilization. But then there is an emerging approach to all this, focus on institutional experimentation, which is, I'm going to explain later, which is different from policy experimentation. And then the goal of designing those institutions is to reduce political distortion, as I described earlier. So what is institutional editing? So from the 90s, we show that institutions are important. And the way you capture the effect of an institution is by describing the game, the decision-making process, and show how the game structure incentives of politicians to behave, to well behave or not well behave. So, but that literature is not too much focused on institutional change. But institutional change can be major, like a revolution, a breakdown of an autocratic regime, like in South Africa, for instance, and what political scientists call constitutional moment, and Lenin called revolutionary moment, But most change happen incrementally. It's some altering of the decision-making process that can make things better or worse. So I gave an example I'm not going to go through, where in presence of low provision of public goods, where you don't have enough incentive to maintain an existing public good, a school or a hospital, one solution could be to get people to commit beforehand by deciding, by having a stage in that game where they decide to provide the public good to begin with. To signal beforehand that if it's provided, they will be willing to help maintain it. And you can use some forward induction rationality arguments to explain why this can lead to a unique equilibrium. So I will share the paper with you where I describe an example of a game that, in a way, by adding a stage, by editing a decision-making process, by adding a stage to the game, can actually eliminate the bad equilibrium where nobody invests in maintaining the public good to where everybody is willing to invest in the public good. So Anyway, I'm not going to go through the example because it's quite intuitive. So now, if it's valuable to take existing institutions, edit them to improve outcome, particularly by solving coordination failure, how do we measure the value of this addition? So if you edit an institution, how do we know that we would be better off? So then we need to come up with a measure of institutional impact. Changing the game from the status quo to an edited version. How much improvement should we expect on the outcome? Typically, when you have an institution, there are two sets of mechanisms. One is that the institution will lead to a policy, and the policy drives the improvement. But it could well be the case that the institution gives people a sense of excitement, optimism, that makes them more willing to invest in the success of the institution. So the effect can be driven instrumentally by policy. It can also be driven intrinsically by what playing the game does to people. And I think when we are studying policy impact, this is an important element. And why? Well, because perhaps a sense of agency and ownership, something can add to the value of the intervention. So again, the focus of my talk will be based on deliberation. So what deliberation does, first, is clarity. People know each other's preferences. People know who is angry, who is happy. They have time to talk to each other and know where everybody stands. It also gives a sense of agency. So either because people know each other's preferences and can coordinate, but also they think that the decision is in their hands. They own the outcome, So that's very important. So the intrinsic effect, in a paper that I wrote with colleagues, is that second part, is how optimistic, how excited people become by playing the game, and the effort that they put towards the success of this outcome is what is the intrinsic value of the institution. So I did some technical exercise to explain this. I'm going to not focus on it. So now, I will give two examples of institutional editing in the literature. So one is on chieftaincy in Zimbabwe. So, chiefs in many locations, many communities, play an important role in public good provision. So as Chris showed in his piece in 2008, and Asimoglu, Reed, and John Robinson in 2014, chiefs can create distortion. They can enforce the property rights of highly connected individuals and leave others behind. So one institutional editing that Baldwin from Yale has done is to take an existing chieftaincy and propose advisors, technical advisors to the king, or to the chief. And this intervention led to an improved governance, whether public good provision, but also inclusive representation. But I think the most spectacular case of institutional experimentation is market reform in China. The distortion was a communist system with over-centralization, no market competition, inequitable education system. And Deng Xiaoping introduced reform of political decentralization, setting up special economic zone, education reform to improve access. And the story of growth miracle in China is directly linked to this. So particularly because this reform was done through, experimentation, where every reform was, properly experimented, adjusted before being scaling up. So as I said earlier, I will talk to you about deliberation. First of all, deliberation, even in the political philosophy literature, praise the fact that it makes policies less divisive. It helps consensus-driven, process. And so the reason why this is important for me is because it's endogenous to African societies. So if you run an experimental edit with deliberation, it's likely to be more legitimate. It's more likely to be accepted because people feel that this is what their ancestors, their parents have done all along. And, some philosophers went to the extreme. Actually, they are just taking proverbs from many communities, particularly in South Africa, where one says, if you are alone, you are an animal. You are two, then you are a human being. So interdependence is what makes us human beings. So the natural institution for interdependent individuals is deliberation. So there are, examples of deliberation, deliberative institutions all across Africa, and the problem is to make it to sound too nostalgic. Say, oh yeah, our ancestors used to do this, it was fantastic. Let's just forget about voting, forget about elections, whatever. Let's just bring, come on, it won't work. So, but you cannot ignore that completely. So one middle ground will be then to take the essence of deliberation, to institutionalize it, and insert it in an existing decision-making process. I'm afraid to talk about genetic editing because it makes it sound too extreme. But what I mean is not very different. It's like taking what it is, get something that's natural in the setting where you are, formalize it, and insert it, and see what happens. So, all right, so I'm going to give 3 examples to illustrate what we have done with this approach. One is on political selection and voter agency. One on that's published in a couple of places. Bureaucratic deliberation and performance. In the first case, it's just town hall meetings. So as opposed to just massive one-way communication rallies by candidates, we get them to organize their campaign in small town hall meetings. I'm going to give the detail in a second. The second one is bureaucratic deliberation, which consists of using the opportunity of a report to get the staff of a local government to meet closed door to discuss the result and see what happened. And the last one in Nigeria is on organizing education summit to leverage individuals' knowledge, preferences, and agency in implementing education policy. So, there's a literature on information and information provision, deliberation in the political setting. But what we are doing was a while ago, in March 2011 in Benin, we selected 160 villages. We talked to candidates who wanted to play the game with us. So the edited institution is a town hall meeting where I'm going to describe in a second what it was, and then a control where it was business as usual. So here is what the town hall meeting looked like. you know. And then we find that overall it has positive effect on turnout and on voting for the candidate who run the experiment. So it's interesting. All else being equal, you are more likely to get votes in place where you do town hall meeting than a place where you do a mix of rallies and town hall meeting, mostly rallies. And what is interesting is that the town hall meeting is 10 times cheaper. So the impact is at, at least 5 levels. One is better information for voters, higher electoral participation, interestingly, convergence, like poor and rich, women and men, young and old, they have, as a result of the deliberation, similar preferences. So the level of polarization of the community has decreased. We also see more ethical voting. So you have more willingness to reject candidates who give money, because people perceive giving money as a sign of corruption. So in the literature, people think that, well, if you give money, they'll vote for you because they are poor, blah, blah, blah. Deliberation helps, for instance, get people to actually punish the practice of vote buying. So anyway, so that's about this one. So bureaucratic deliberation, that's the new one, super fascinating. So there is a literature on audits, and Claudio participated very on this. So the question is, when there is bad audits, a bad audit result, can internal accountability be effective? Well, if you put the judgments of the audit report in the hands of the bureaucrats themselves, you can develop a sense of accountability, horizontal accountability that might help them to better behave next time. But then, if people start talking about malpractices, the fear, the fact that the ground started shaking, the fact that more information might come in the future can lead to lower trust, get people to be scared, and the whole thing potentially could unravel. You see what I mean? Okay. Here is the intervention. So we got the audit report, and we organized 3 meetings. The first meeting was to discuss the audit report. The second one is to present the results of survey of the bureaucrats so that they know what they think of each other. And then the third one is discuss citizen survey to think of what the citizens think about the bureaucrats. So in the control, unedited institution, there is no deliberation. So here is what it was done. The treatment place is one place, and then it's one randomly picked municipality, and then the neighboring municipality serve as control. So here are the meetings, and some pictures of meetings. So we find, that it leads to improvements in performance and lower probability of bribe being paid, but there is no short-term impact on service delivery because the outcome was measured 1 year the following audit cycle after the treatment. So here are the tables. So anyway, collective deliberation help improve performance. There is no short-term impact on service provision. But then, as I told you earlier, so it leads to a decline in social cohesion among the bureaucrats, at least in the first year. Okay, so is it because the decision is put in the hands of bureaucrats themselves that led them to feel like they would own the outcome of an improved governance? Is it because the fear that more information will be coming out, given that there is closed world meeting where people were pointing fingers, people were denouncing each other. They are afraid that this can only get worse, and as a result, they get their act together. Either way, I think it's good that this meeting, in fact, this intervention, help improve performance. Okay, so the last one is still, we have the data, we're writing the paper, but it's not completed. It's not completed, but let me present the preliminary results. So the contest is the states, 3 states in Nigeria, where with several local governments. We did research to collect education priorities, the state of education, infrastructure, learning, etc. And we prepared a report. Second stage, we organize an education summit where the teachers, the parents, the NGO, they all get together and discuss those reports for a day. And the third part, which is super interesting, we draft a report of the deliberation in a form of social contract, in a form of something that, as a collective, we agree, we decide to do. You see what I mean? So it's a formalization of the concept of social contract, if you will. And the outcome is ownership of decisions, education investments, and learning. So this is some pictures of the deliberation. It's somewhere in the middle there. So I should let you know that before I launched the Education Summit, I tried to pretend as much as possible that I'm actually Nigerian as well. So by saying that my great-great-great-grandfather actually came from Nigeria, so that people will feel like it's not just a stupid foreigner who is lecturing them about what they should do, but actually one of theirs. And it helped that I look Igbo for many people, and some people think that I'm Yoruba. But anyway, so I can pretend I'm one of them. So it was fantastic. I'm not going to go through all the details. So a full day of discussion, and we reach, in one of the locations called Nkanu, we reach this kind of agreement that we wrote properly. And then what is interesting is that after the agreement is written, we send it to the governor to prepare the work plan. Say, okay, you were there. This is what people have said. They bargain, they decide on the priorities. Here, they said, improving school infrastructure is the way to go. Here is security improvement, the way to go. Here, you have all that. What do you want to do? So the governor prepared the work plan. And then later on, we took the contract that people signed at the meeting, the work plan that the government proposed, and went to discuss it at all the schools, the treatment schools that were involved. And 3 interesting results. One is strong improvement in school infrastructure. We have less learning loss, which is positive, in the treatment communities due to COVID-19. But we didn't find any real improvement in stakeholders' commitment. But what I know is that people use this contract to fundraise in the diaspora to come, because the thing that is going to give people from the diaspora is sense that the local community back home are organized, they are decided, they know what they want, they have sense of priorities, and so on and so forth. And the evidence is that people are actually willing to donate to improve infrastructure, to support the kids back home. So, all right, so that's basically what deliberation does. But let me go to another level by saying political economy should be more prescriptive. It shouldn't be about identifying devils who are doing evil things. It should be about, think about environment you can create so that they can behave as if they have no evil intent. I'm not inventing that. can't say that exactly the same thing 1795 in Perpetual Peace. He said the problem of the Republican state is not insoluble for a race of devils, granted that they have intelligence. How to establish a constitution so that although they want to do bad things, they can act as check on each other so that in their actions in public, they behave as if they don't have any evil sentiment. And he said, that problem must have a solution. So it's not like we have a ready-made model that we can use to make politicians behave. We need to think about it. And this is what institutional experimentation is, you know. So, okay, so in this lecture, I give myself, yeah, a minute, that's exactly what I need. So, so we want to take on the challenge to think about ways to make politicians behave, you know. So it's I know ourselves. Now, to finish, you know, I have 1 minute, but I'm sure you may ask yourself, what happened to this skinny left-wing activist that I showed in the second slide? Well, he's doing well. You know, he set up a university called the African School of Economics, and we have a campus in Abuja that will actually have a public policy school to get to think about how we make politicians and bureaucrats behave. Maybe some of them will be politicians or bureaucrats themselves. And having learned how to behave, perhaps, in my school, we can help improve the outcome. But as a way of acknowledgement, another thing that I did is to set up an African Academy of Sciences called the Pan-African Research Council. And this is a meeting with the head of state in Africa, at the AU meeting. But more importantly, I need to share with you before I end, just 30 seconds. So this is...
Negotiate with Claudio.
Okay, all right. So, okay, so I need to show you that none of this needs crazy stuff like prison, universities, whatever, would not have been possible. Oh, even this, American Academy of Arts and Sciences and all these things would not have been possible without my wife, my kids, and, you know, it's important for crazy people to be checked regularly by people who actually care for them, you know, so she'll be really happy to hear that. But then, you know, I still managed to have some fun, as you can see to the right, at my daughter's wedding. I practiced 9 months for this event, and it was hip-hop, you know, so this guy came a long way. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Without further ado, actually, I'm going to hand over to you, Claudio, with apologies for a slightly late start, so you can take an extra 5.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks. This was fascinating, Leonard. So my job is really hard. I need to keep you awake for 15 minutes and not run through the door so that Jacob and Rolf can end up. So let me start actually saying thank you, because it was really a magnificent conference. I think we're all very... So on top of keeping you awake, I need actually to tell you what happened in governance, political economy institutions in the past 20 years. So it's a pretty easy job in 15 minutes. So let me start. Let me take you 25 years ago. How did kind of like, as economists and as political economists, there are not many actually at the time, how did we view the world? And if I take you 25 years ago, there was kind of a big project starting inside the World Bank trying to measure these things, right? There was a working paper called Governance Matters. And the idea was to try to have some numbers and create some indices that people could understand why is it the case that some countries look good in some dimensions of governance and others look pretty bad. And then what people did with those type of indices was really, well, what people did back in the day, correlate with like country stuff, right? So we have a lot of those. Actually, there was a nice review that was done in the handbook of Development Economics by Moine, Jean-Marie Ballan, and Robinson, 2010, which was actually had the title Governance and Development, right? It was really about trying to make sense of some of these correlations that in rich countries, things look really good. You have rule of law, you have less corruption, you have better regulation, and also the fact that there's a huge variation across countries in terms of how institutions go, right? Like some countries are presidentialist, others are parliamentarism, some are managed by coalitions, others are not, and all those things, they actually correlate with economic development. Then came a bunch of people, some of them here in the room, actually Chris and Rohini wrote a really nice review saying like, look, we need to bring all this macro stuff to actually micro institutions. We need to understand what's going on. And starting there, we have kind of a revolution, I would say, and a revolution in 3 different dimensions. Now, of course, in 12.5 minutes, I won't be able to tell everything. I'm going to do my best. I'll go kind of like over what I think things that we learned and that are important. But I think there were 3 things that happened. The first was surf on the revolution was happening in terms of credibility and use natural experiments, focusing a lot on within-country variation to understand how different rules map into different governance, how governments spend money, corruption, all those type of things. The second thing, new ways that we can measure governance, right? Like we used to talk about corruption, but it was all about perceptions of corruption. And Jacob sitting here was one of the first to actually try to measure this in this very, very nice paper back in the QJE, was this idea that you can actually go down and have creative ways to measure those things, right? And the third thing that happened, which also was happening in many things that we have seen in the past 3 days, was the revolution in actual field experiments, RCTs, and the example here is what Ben Olken did in Indonesia, for example, in terms of audits, but there was a lot of ideas taught at that time of let's try to experiment with some of those things and try to see what were the effects. So what have we learned, okay? So I'm gonna separate, so I have 11 minutes, maybe I'm gonna do like 3 minutes each, let's see how it goes. But when I think about governance, I think, and many people I think in that way, you can separate in different components. What do we mean by governance, okay? So I'm gonna separate into what we call representation and political inclusiveness. So are people represented, both from the sides of voters and politicians? The second one is about accountability, right? When we elect politicians, are they accountable to voters? Are they doing the things they're supposed to be doing? And 3, I'm gonna talk in the end a little bit also about state capacity, state effectiveness, and things that I think are going on and are interesting. And hopefully in the last 2-3 minutes, I'll also speak a little bit about political economy of public policy and how should we think about those things and things that I think are exciting and people are doing. Okay, so let me go straight into representation and political inclusiveness. So I think there are 2 things that we learn. Okay, and of course, I'm citing I picked some papers, not everything can be here. But I think one thing that we learn is when you bring marginalized voters into democracy, things improve in the sense that representation and public policies that are chosen map better into what poor voters want, right? And I think the famous case of that was when, for example, Brazil introduced electronic voting. Thomas Fujiwara has a nice paper showing that. You bring different voters that were disenfranchised